The stars had always seemed peaceful to Admiral Grace Holland. She had spent 40 years looking up at them, first as a child in Kentucky, and then as a soldier fighting humanity's small wars across the solar system. But on this cold morning in December 2247, the stars brought only death. 3,000 warships emerged from hyperspace at the edge of the Sol system. They came in perfect formation, their hulls gleaming with the cold light of distant suns. Each ship was larger than anything humanity had ever built. Each one carried enough firepower to burn a continent to ash. Together, they formed the greatest armada the Galactic Council had ever assembled against a single world. Grace stood on the bridge of the carrier Defiance and watched the enemy fleet on her tactical display. Her gray hair was pulled back in a tight bun, and her weathered face showed no fear. She had fought too many battles to be afraid of death, but she had never faced anything like this. The communication officer turned to her with pale cheeks. A transmission was coming through from the Council fleet. Grace nodded, and the holographic image of Counselor appeared before her. And was a species that had ruled the galaxy for 10,000 years. His body was tall and thin, covered in scales the color of dried blood. His eyes were yellow and cold, like the eyes of a snake watching a mouse. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. Earth had 72 hours to surrender. All military forces would lay down their weapons. All governments would dissolve. All humans would submit to Council authority for relocation and reassignment. If these terms were not met, the Council fleet would reduce every city on Earth to rubble. There would be no negotiation. There would be no mercy. This was the will of the Galactic Council. The transmission ended, and silence fell across the bridge. Grace had been a member of the Council for 30 years. She remembered when the first alien ships arrived in Earth's skies, offering humanity a place among the stars. She remembered the celebrations, the hope, the dreams of a golden future, but the reality had been different. Humanity was the youngest species in the Council, and the elder races treated them like servants. Humans were given the worst jobs, the worst worlds, the worst terms of trade. They were tolerated but never respected. And now, it seemed, they were no longer even tolerated. Grace opened a channel to Geneva, where President Daniel was waiting in the Emergency Command Center. His face appeared on her screen, tired and drawn. He was a good man, she thought. A man who had spent his whole life trying to find peaceful solutions. But there was no peaceful solution to 3,000 warships. Told her that he had tried to contact the Council. His messages had been ignored. He had reached out to species that humanity had called friends, but none of them would respond. Earth stood alone. Grace asked if he had made a decision, closed his eyes for a long moment. Then he spoke the words that would change everything. Protocol Omega was authorized. The words sent a chill down her spine, not from fear but from the weight of what they meant. Protocol Omega was humanity's darkest secret, a plan that had been developed over 20 years in absolute secrecy. It was built on a simple truth that Earth's leaders had understood from the very beginning. The galaxy was not a place of friendship and cooperation. It was a place where the strong devoured the weak, and if humanity wanted to survive, they would have to become strong. Grace ended the transmission and turned to her executive officer, Commander Lisa Grant. Lisa was young, barely 40, with sharp eyes and steady hands. She had been chosen for this position because she could make hard decisions without hesitation. Grace told her to begin activation of all Protocol Omega assets. Lisa nodded and began issuing orders. Across the solar system, things began to move. On the moon, massive doors opened in the gray dust, revealing weapons platforms that had been hidden for 2 decades. On Mars, underground hangars released squadrons of fighters that the Council had never known existed. In the asteroid belt, automated defense systems came online, their targeting computers locking onto the distant enemy fleet. And in the cold darkness beyond Neptune, shipyards that had been disguised as mining operations began launching warships by the dozen. Lieutenant Park, the intelligence officer, approached Grace with a data tablet. His hands were shaking slightly. He had intercepted communications between Council ships, messages that were never meant to be heard by human ears. The truth was worse than any of them had imagined. The Council had no intention of honoring a surrender. The plan had always been enslavement. Humanity's population would be scattered across the galaxy, separated into small groups that could never unite. Their children would be raised as servants. Their culture would be erased. In 3 generations, there would be nothing left of Earth but ruins and memories. Grace read the intercepted messages twice. Then she handed the tablet back to and thanked him. Her voice was calm, but inside her chest, something cold and hard had taken root. She had spent her life following rules, respecting authority, believing that patience and diplomacy would eventually earn humanity its place among the stars. She had been a fool. The Council had never seen humans as partners. They had seen them as tools, as resources to be used and discarded. And now they had come to collect what they believed was theirs. But they had made a mistake. They had given humanity 30 years to prepare. They had underestimated what a species born on a world of predators, storms, and earthquakes could build when they were given time and motivation. They had looked at Earth's small fleet and primitive technology and seen weakness. They were about to learn how wrong they were. Grace walked to the center of her bridge and opened a channel to every ship in the human fleet. Her voice carried across the void to 200 vessels, each one crewed by men and women who had trained their whole lives for this moment. She told them that the enemy believed humanity was weak. The enemy believed that humans would kneel and beg for mercy. The enemy believed that this war was already won. She told them that in 72 hours the enemy would learn the truth. Earth did not kneel, Earth did not beg, and Earth did not lose. The channel closed, and Grace turned to look out the main viewport at the distant lights of the enemy fleet. Somewhere out there, and was probably celebrating his easy victory. He had no idea what was coming. Grace allowed herself a small smile. The galaxy was about to learn what it meant to threaten human soil. Admiral Orr stood on the command deck of his flagship, the Eternal Dominion, and watched the human fleet with amusement. His tactical officers had counted 200 ships, most of them small and poorly armed. It was almost insulting that the Council had sent 3,000 warships to deal with such pathetic opposition. He was a veteran of 12 campaigns against rebellious species. He had burned worlds and shattered civilizations. The humans would be no different. They would fight, they would lose, and they would submit. It was the natural order of things. His sensors showed minor energy fluctuations near the human moon, but his officers dismissed them as equipment errors. There was nothing on that barren rock except old mining stations and communication relays. Certainly nothing that could threaten the greatest fleet in galactic history. Or ordered his fleet to advance. Across the solar system, Admiral Grace Holland watched the enemy begin their approach. She stood in the tactical center of the Defiance, surrounded by holographic displays that showed every ship, every weapon, every hidden asset that humanity had spent 2 decades building. The time for secrets was over. She opened a channel to Dr. Cole, the man who had designed humanity's most devastating weapons. Was in his laboratory on Mars, surrounded by the tools of destruction that he had created. He was a quiet man, uncomfortable with violence, but he understood that survival sometimes required terrible things. Grace asked if the quantum disruption missiles were ready, confirmed that they were. The weapons had taken 15 years to develop, based on theories that the Council believed were impossible. They could pass through any known shield technology like light through glass. When they detonated, they did not simply destroy their targets. They tore them apart at the molecular level, leaving nothing but expanding clouds of atoms. Grace thanked him and closed the channel. Then she turned to Commander Lisa Grant, who was waiting aboard her stealth destroyer, the Silent Hunter. Lisa's squadron consisted of 50 ships equipped with cloaking technology that the Council did not know existed. They had slipped past the enemy fleet in the first hours after the ultimatum, positioning themselves behind the formation. For 2 days, they had drifted in absolute silence, their crews barely breathing as enemy ships passed within kilometers of their hulls. Now they waited like wolves watching a herd of sheep. Grace asked Lisa if her squadron was in position. Lisa confirmed that they were. Every ship was ready. Every crew was prepared to die. Grace opened a channel to General, commander of Earth's ground forces and orbital defenses, was an old soldier from battles on 3 worlds with a voice like grinding stone. He reported that the lunar defense platforms were online and targeting. The Mars orbital stations were armed. The particle beam cannons on Earth's surface were tracking the enemy fleet. Grace took a deep breath and looked at the tactical display. The Council fleet was advancing in a standard formation, confident and arrogant. They had no idea that they were walking into a trap. She opened a broadcast channel to the enemy fleet. Her voice carried across the void to every ship. She told them that they had come to claim her world. She told them that they would leave as dust or not at all. On the Eternal Dominion, Admiral or received the message. He laughed, a harsh sound that echoed across his bridge. The human admiral was brave, he admitted, foolish but brave. He ordered his fleet to increase speed. The sooner this was over, the better. His sensor officer reported another anomaly. Ships were emerging from hyperspace behind the fleet, or frowned and demanded details. The officer's voice trembled as he responded. 400 human warships had appeared from nowhere, cutting off the fleet's retreat. Or felt the first cold touch of doubt. Where had those ships come from? His intelligence had reported that humanity had no hidden shipyards, no secret fleets. But the ships were there, real and solid, their weapons already powering up. He ordered his fleet to adjust formation, turning to face this new threat. But before his ships could respond, space itself seemed to tear apart. Lisa Grant gave the order to. 50 stealth destroyers appeared in the heart of the Council formation. They had been invisible moments before, ghosts passing through the enemy fleet. Now they were angels of death. The quantum disruption missiles launched in a single devastating volley. 200 of them, each one carrying enough destructive power to crack a moon. They passed through shields like they did not exist and detonated inside the enemy ships. The effect was immediate and terrible. Council warships simply came apart, their hulls dissolving into clouds of metallic dust. Reactors went critical and exploded. Ammunition stores detonated in chains of fire. In 60 seconds, 200 enemy ships were destroyed. Or stared at the carnage in disbelief. This was impossible. No species had ever developed weapons that could bypass Council shielding. The humans were primitives, barely capable of interstellar travel. How could they have built such things? He had no time to find answers. The human main fleet was attacking from the front, their ships moving with speed and coordination that should have been beyond them. The reinforcements from behind were closing in, and the stealth destroyers were already repositioning for another strike. On the moon, the hidden defense platforms opened fire. Beams of concentrated energy reached across the void and tore through Council ships like needles through cloth. On Mars, orbital stations launched missiles by the thousand. On Earth, particle beam cannons fired into the sky, their shots visible from space as pillars of blue-white light. Or realized with growing horror that he had been led into a killing field. The humans had planned this for years, maybe decades. Every moment of apparent weakness had been a lie. Every display of primitive technology had been a mask. He ordered a retreat, but Lisa Grant's destroyers had already moved to block the escape routes. The fleet was trapped between 3 human forces, surrounded on all sides by weapons that should not exist. Admiral Grace Holland watched the battle unfold from her command center. She felt no joy at the destruction, no satisfaction in the dying. These were living beings being torn apart, creatures with families and hopes and fears. But they had come to enslave her people. They had planned to scatter humanity across the galaxy like seeds in the wind. They had left her no choice. The battle continued for 6 hours. Council ships fought with courage and desperation, but they were outmatched at every turn. Human tactics were unpredictable, their weapons devastating, their coordination perfect. By the end, less than 500 council ships remained, huddled together in a defensive formation that grew smaller with every passing minute. Counselor and watched from his command station at the edge of the system. His scales had turned pale with shock. This was not possible. This could not be happening. He opened a channel to the council and demanded reinforcements. Every ship from every nearby system. The humans had to be stopped before this disaster spread. Grace received intelligence about the reinforcement call. She smiled and turned to her officers. "Good," she said. She had been worried that the council might give up too easily. The first battle was over, but the war had only just begun. The reinforcement fleet arrived 9 days after the first battle. 5,000 warships emerged from hyperspace in perfect formation, the largest armada assembled since the ancient wars that had forged the Council itself. Admiral X commanded from the dreadnought Wrath of Ages, a ship so massive that it could carry a small city within its hull. X was not like Or. He had studied humanity for years, fascinated by their strange history of constant warfare. He knew they were dangerous, more dangerous than the Council wanted to admit, but even he was not prepared for what he found when his fleet arrived. The wreckage of the first armada floated in a vast field of debris around Mars. Broken hulls tumbled slowly through the void, their markings still visible on scorched metal. Emergency beacons blinked uselessly into the darkness. There were no survivors to rescue. X studied the tactical data from the destroyed fleet's final transmissions. The humans had weapons that bypassed shields. They had ships that could become invisible. They had defense platforms hidden across the entire solar system. Everything the Council believed about human technology was wrong. He ordered his fleet to advance slowly, sensors at maximum power, watching for any sign of ambush. But the humans did not hide this time. Admiral Grace Holland brought her fleet out to meet him. She had lost ships in the first battle, good ships with brave crews. But her losses were small compared to what she had inflicted. Her remaining force of 500 warships formed a battle line between Mars and the asteroid belt, directly in the path of the Council reinforcements. Behind her, the shipyards of the belt continued their work. More ships were coming, a steady stream of reinforcements that would join the battle as they were completed. Time was on humanity's side. Grace opened a channel to Captain, the commander of the fighter squadron known as Death's Hand. Was a young man, barely 30, with quick reflexes and no fear. He had grown up in the orbital stations above Earth, learning to fly before he learned to walk. His squadron had destroyed more enemy ships in the first battle than any other unit. She told him that the enemy dreadnought was his target. Cut off the head and the body would fall. Acknowledged the order and led his squadron into the void. The battle began at the edge of the asteroid belt. Council ships advanced in waves, their commanders determined to overwhelm the human defenders with sheer numbers. But Grace had learned from humanity's history of warfare. She knew that numbers alone did not win battles. She had positioned her fleet among the asteroids, using the massive rocks as cover and concealment. Human ships would appear from behind an asteroid, fire devastating volleys, and disappear before the enemy could respond. Council formations were broken apart as they tried to navigate the chaotic battlefield. Commander Lisa Grant led her stealth destroyers in hit-and-run attacks against the enemy flanks. They would fire their quantum missiles and cloak again before retaliation could arrive. Each attack cost the Council dozens of ships. Each attack was impossible to predict or prevent. X tried to adapt. He ordered his fleet to disperse, making them harder targets for coordinated attacks. But dispersal only made his ships easier to isolate and destroy. He ordered concentration, but concentration made them vulnerable to the devastating quantum weapons. Nothing he tried worked. And his squadron reached the wrath of ages after fighting through 3 waves of interceptors. The dreadnought's defenses were impressive, layers of shields and point defense weapons that could destroy a small moon, but had studied the ship's design, stolen from Council databases years ago. He knew its weaknesses. He led his squadron under the great ship's belly, where the shields were thinnest. They flew through a storm of defensive fire, losing pilots with every second. But they reached their target, a cluster of reactor vents that radiated heat into space. Fired every weapon he had into those vents. The explosion tore through the dreadnought's engineering section. Power failed across the massive ship. Shields collapsed. Weapons went silent. The wrath of ages, pride of the Council fleet, drifted helplessly as secondary explosions ripped through its hull. X evacuated to a smaller vessel moments before the main reactor went critical. He watched his flagship die in a ball of nuclear fire and felt something he had never experienced before: fear. The battle continued for 2 weeks. It was not a single engagement but a series of running fights across the inner solar system. Grace refused to give the Council a decisive battle. Instead, she bled them slowly, attacking their supply lines, destroying their command ships, wearing down their numbers one day at a time. Dr. Cole worked without sleep to produce more quantum missiles, general coordinated ground defenses that prevented any Council ship from approaching Earth. Commander Lisa Grant became a ghost that haunted Council nightmares, her stealth destroyers appearing without warning and vanishing without trace. The Council fleet tried to retreat, to regroup at the edge of the system and call for more reinforcements. But Grace had anticipated this. She had positioned ships along every possible escape route. The enemy was trapped, surrounded, with nowhere to run. By the end of the second week, less than 1,000 Council ships remained. They gathered together in a desperate defensive formation, their shields overlapping, their weapons pointed outward at the human forces that encircled them. Grace opened a channel to the enemy fleet. She offered them one chance to surrender. They could lay down their weapons, release their crews to human custody, and submit to trial for their actions. If they refused, she would destroy every ship except one, which she would send back to the Council with a message. X received the offer. He was a proud warrior from a proud species that had never surrendered in 10,000 years. He refused. Grace closed the channel and gave the order. The attack was swift and merciless. Human ships closed in from every direction, their weapons firing in continuous streams of destruction. Quantum missiles tore through shields. Particle beams cut through hulls. Fighters swarmed over the dying fleet like insects over fallen prey. When it was over, a single Council ship remained. It was a small vessel, barely capable of hyperspace travel, with a crew of 12. Grace had them brought aboard the Defiance, where she gave them a message to carry back to their masters. She told them that humanity was coming. The Council had started this war, but humanity would finish it. Every species that had voted for Earth's destruction would face justice. Every world that had supported the invasion would answer for its crimes. There would be no negotiation. There would be no mercy. The only choice the Council had left was how many of their people would die before they accepted defeat. The messenger ship jumped to hyperspace, carrying Grace's words across the galaxy. The solar system fell silent, filled only with the wreckage of 5,000 enemy ships. Humanity had won the first battles, but they all knew this was only the beginning. The messenger ship arrived at the Council capital 3 days later. Its crew was taken before the assembled representatives of 12 species, where they delivered Admiral Holland's words in voices that trembled with shock and fear. counselor and listened with scales that had turned the color of ash. He had expected victory. He had expected human slaves in chains and human cities in flames. Instead, he had received the greatest military defeat in Council history. 8,000 warships destroyed, millions of soldiers dead, and now the humans were threatening to bring the war to Council space. He demanded another fleet, larger than before. He called for the complete mobilization of every military force in the Council. The humans had to be crushed before their rebellion spread to other species. But the other counselors hesitated. They had seen the reports from the surviving ships. They knew about the quantum weapons and the stealth technology. They knew that humans fought with a ferocity that bordered on madness. Many of them wondered if this war was worth continuing. 3 minor species quietly their support. The and the had long been victims of Council oppression. They saw in humanity's victory a chance for their own freedom. Their ambassadors made secret contact with Earth, offering intelligence and assistance. Ambassador Sanders received their messages in a hidden location on the dark side of the moon. She had been Earth's representative to the Council until the war began, when she was expelled and marked for execution. Now she served as humanity's spy master, coordinating the network of allies and informants that was growing across the galaxy. She brought the information to President Daniel, who studied it carefully. The Council was divided. Some species wanted to continue the war at any cost. Others wanted to negotiate. And a few, like were ready to openly side with humanity. Understood that military victory alone would not be enough. They needed to break the Council politically, to shatter the alliance of species that had ruled the galaxy for. And to do that, they needed to show that humanity was not just strong, but just. He broadcast a message to every world in Council space. His face appeared on screens across 1,000 planets, speaking in simple words that translation programs could easily convert. He told them that Earth had never wanted this war. He told them that humanity had been peaceful members of the Council, seeking nothing but equality and respect. He told them that the Council's leaders had tried to enslave his people, to scatter them across the galaxy, and erase their culture from history. He told them that humanity would no longer submit. They would fight until they achieved justice, not just for themselves, but for every species that had suffered under Council rule. Any world that stood with them would be treated as an ally. Any world that stood against them would face the consequences. The message spread like fire across the galaxy. On 100 worlds, oppressed species whispered about the humans who had defeated the Council's greatest fleet. They shared stories of quantum weapons and invisible ships, and an admiral who had turned 8,000 warships into dust. Hope began to grow in places where hope had long been forbidden. Admiral Grace Holland did not wait for the political situation to develop. She took her fleet into Council space, targeting the military installations and supply bases that supported the enemy war effort. Her tactics were brutal but precise. She did not attack civilian targets or infrastructure that supported ordinary lives. Instead, she focused on military shipyards, weapons factories, and command centers. She gave warnings before each attack, allowing non-combatants to evacuate. But when the warnings expired, she held nothing back. The Council tried to respond, sending fleets to defend their territories. But Grace was never where they expected. She would strike at one system and be gone before reinforcements arrived, appearing light years away to attack another target. Her fleet seemed to be everywhere at once, a phantom force that could not be caught or cornered. Commander Lisa Grant developed new tactics for her stealth destroyers. They would slip into enemy systems ahead of the main fleet, gathering intelligence and sabotaging defenses. When Grace's ships arrived, they found targets already weakened and confused, easy prey for human weapons. Dr. Cole unveiled his greatest creation, a device that could generate a hyperspace interdiction field. Within its range, no ship could enter or leave hyperspace. Enemy fleets could be trapped, unable to escape or receive reinforcements. It changed the nature of warfare. Grace used the device for the first time at the Battle of Prime, the of-and species. A Council defense fleet of 2,000 ships was caught in the interdiction field, unable to retreat as human forces closed in from every direction. Grace offered them the chance to surrender. This time, many of them accepted. Over half the Council fleet powered down their weapons and submitted to human custody. The rest fought and died. Word of the surrender spread quickly. For the first time in history, Council warships had willingly given themselves up to a lesser species. The psychological impact was enormous. More species began to question whether the war was worth fighting. More ambassadors made secret contact with Earth and watched his coalition crumble with mounting desperation. He had gambled everything on a quick victory, believing that humanity could be crushed before they became a real threat. Now he faced the possibility of complete defeat. He made one final attempt to rally support. He traveled to the neutral systems, meeting with leaders who had not yet chosen a side. He warned them that human victory would mean chaos, the end of the order that had kept the galaxy stable for 10,000 years. He promised rewards to those who joined him and punishment to those who refused. But Ambassador Sanders had been there before him. She had spoken with the same leaders, sharing evidence of Council atrocities that had been hidden for centuries. Plans for genocide against minor species. Secret programs to eliminate any race that might challenge Council dominance. Documents proving that the war against humanity was just the first step in a larger campaign of oppression. When he finished his speeches, he found that his audiences had already made their decisions. 5 more species announced their withdrawal from the Council alliance. 2 openly declared their support for humanity. The war was not yet over. The Council still had ships, still had weapons, still had the will to fight. But the tide had turned. Every day brought new allies to humanity's cause. Every battle weakened the enemy's resolve. Grace Holland stood on the bridge of the Defiance and looked at the tactical display. Months ago, she had faced the greatest armada in galactic history with only 200 ships. Now, she commanded a coalition fleet of over 1,000 vessels from 6 different species. More were coming every day. She thought about the message she would soon deliver to the Council itself. Not a threat this time, but an ultimatum. Surrender or face destruction. Accept humanity as equals or watch their ancient order burn. The galaxy was changing, and humanity would be the ones to reshape it. The Council capital was a world called Eternal Throne, a planet of crystal spires and golden towers that had served as the seat of galactic government for 8,000 years. No enemy fleet had ever approached its skies. No hostile species had ever threatened its sacred halls. It was the heart of civilization, untouchable and eternal. Until the day 2,000 human warships emerged from hyperspace above its atmosphere. Admiral Grace Holland stood on the bridge of the Defiance and looked down at the world below. The capital city stretched across an entire continent, its buildings reaching toward the stars like fingers grasping at power. Somewhere down there, the rulers of the galaxy were watching her fleet with horror in their eyes. She had fought for 6 months to reach this moment. She had destroyed fleets and conquered systems and watched good people die in the cold darkness between stars. The cost had been terrible, but it had brought her here, to the place where everything would finally change. President Daniel was aboard a diplomatic vessel at the center of the fleet, surrounded by bodyguards and advisors. He had insisted on coming himself, despite the danger. This moment was too important to delegate. The future of humanity would be decided in the next few hours, and he intended to be the one deciding it. The Council had 24 hours to respond to humanity's demands. If they refused, Grace had orders to begin bombardment of military targets on the planet's surface. She hoped it would not come to that, but she was prepared to do whatever was necessary. Ambassador Sanders had spent weeks preparing for this moment. She had built a coalition of 7 species who supported humanity's cause, each one eager to see the old order fall. Their representatives traveled with the human fleet, ready to speak before the council and demand change. The first response came within an hour. Counselor and appeared on communication screens across the fleet, his scales pale and his voice strained. He demanded that the humans withdraw immediately. He threatened retaliation from council forces across the galaxy. He warned of consequences that would echo through centuries. Grace listened to his threats without expression. When he finished, she simply pointed at the tactical display, which showed the positions of every remaining council warship in the galaxy. There were less than 500. She had destroyed or captured the rest, and had nothing left to threaten with. His words were empty, and they both knew it. President requested permission to address the full council. After hours of debate, the request was granted. A shuttle carried him down to the surface, where armed guards escorted him through the crystal halls to the Chamber of Unity, where the representatives of 12 species waited. Entered the chamber alone. He was a small figure in that vast space, surrounded by beings who had ruled the stars while humanity was still learning to make fire. But he walked with his head high and his shoulders straight. He had nothing to be ashamed of. He spoke for 2 hours. He told the history of humanity's membership in the Council, the 30 years of exploitation and humiliation they had endured. He presented evidence of the plan to enslave his people, the intercepted communications and secret documents that proved the Council's genocidal intentions. He named the species that had voted for Earth's destruction and demanded that they answer for their crimes. Then he presented humanity's demands. The hierarchical caste system that divided species into masters and servants would be abolished. Every species would have equal representation in a reformed government. Reparations would be paid to humanity and to every other species that had suffered under council rule. The leaders responsible for the war against Earth would face trial for their crimes. The chamber erupted in chaos. Some counselors screamed in outrage. Others sat in stunned silence. A few, those who had secretly supported humanity, nodded in quiet approval. Ambassador Sanders presented her evidence next. She showed documents proving that the Council had planned genocide against 3 other minor species, campaigns that would have begun after humanity's destruction. She named the officials who had approved these plans and the species that had supported them. The coalition representatives spoke after her. One by one, they detailed the abuses their peoples had suffered under council rule. The described slave labor camps, the told of cultural suppression, the revealed economic exploitation that had kept their world in poverty for generations. By the end, even some of the elder species were shaken. They had known that the council was not perfect, but many had not understood the true extent of its cruelty. They had been complicit in horrors they had never seen. The vote took 3 days. Species argued and negotiated and threatened. Old alliances shattered and new ones formed. Grace kept her fleet in position above the capital, a constant reminder of what would happen if the council chose to fight. In the end, 7 species voted to accept humanity's demands. 5 voted against, led by N and the, but 7 was enough. The Council's own laws required only a simple majority for constitutional changes. The old order ended with a vote, not a battle, and was arrested by his own guards as he left the chamber. He would stand trial for war crimes, along with dozens of other officials who had planned humanity's enslavement. The Dominion was expelled from the Council, stripped of its leadership role, reduced to a minor power that would take centuries to recover. Grace watched the proceedings from orbit, her hand resting on the command console of her ship. She had spent her whole life preparing for war, training for battles, learning to destroy. Now she was watching peace being born, and she was not sure how to feel. Commander Lisa Grant approached her with a glass of something amber and strong. They had served together for 20 years, through battles and hardships that would have broken lesser soldiers. Lisa knew that Grace needed to talk, even if she did not want to admit it. Grace told her that she had killed millions of people. Council soldiers, yes, but they were still living beings with families and dreams. She had turned their ships into tombs and their bodies into atoms. And now everyone was celebrating, calling her a hero, naming ships after her. It did not feel like victory. It felt like surviving. Lisa reminded her that those soldiers had come to enslave humanity. They had planned to scatter human children across the galaxy and erase human culture from history. Grace had not started this war. She had only finished it. Grace nodded slowly. She knew Lisa was right, but knowing something and feeling it were different things. She would carry the weight of her choices for the rest of her life. 1 year later, Earth hosted the first meeting of the reformed Galactic Assembly. Representatives from 23 species gathered in Geneva, where they would begin the work of building a new civilization. The old Council's Chamber of Unity had been a place of hierarchy and domination. The new assembly hall was designed as a circle, with every species at the same level, facing each other as equals. President delivered the opening address. He spoke of the past and its horrors, of the war and its costs, of the hope that had brought them all to this moment. He did not promise perfection. He did not claim that all problems were solved, but he promised that humanity would stand with any species that sought justice and freedom. Grace Holland watched from the gallery above the assembly floor. She had retired from military service 3 months ago, passing command of the fleet to Commander Grant. She was tired of war, tired of death, tired of making decisions that cost lives. She wanted peace, even if she was not sure she deserved it. But as she watched the representatives take their seats, as she heard the translators converting words into 100 different languages, she felt something she had not expected: pride. Humanity had faced extinction. They had been dismissed as primitives, targeted for enslavement, attacked by the greatest military force in galactic history, and they had not only survived, they had changed everything. The galaxy would never be the same. Old empires had fallen. New alliances had risen. Species that had been oppressed for were finally free. And at the center of it all were the humans, the young species from a violent world, who had shown the galaxy what it meant to be ruthless in defense of everything they loved. Grace looked out the window at the night sky, at the stars that had once seemed so peaceful. They were not peaceful. They were wild and dangerous and full of wonders beyond imagination, but they were also full of possibility. Humanity had earned its place among those stars. Whatever came next, they would face it together.